Today we're starting a new book. I'll be reading this book every Friday, just like I have been all the other books. And I learned about this book actually from a friend I've made from YouTube, dear friend in Ohio. She told me about the book, and I had read different books by Jesse Stuart. This is the name of the book, is The Thread That Runs So True. And I'd read some of his other writings. He's a really well-known Appalachian writer from Kentucky in days gone by. But I had never read this one. So once she said that I should read it, I thought, okay, I'll find it and I'll read it. Well, I could barely put it down. I just thought it was so interesting. It's not a fiction story. It's kind of the story of his life of being a teacher. He's focusing on his teaching. So really interesting book, and we'll start it today, and I hope that you enjoy it as much as I have. I'm going to go ahead and read the preface in it, just because he tells a little bit about his why he wrote the book, basically. So I'll start with that. 11 years ago, when I began writing The Thread That Runs So True, I said teaching was the greatest profession in the world. Not too many people agreed with me then, but as the years have passed, many have changed their minds until they are in full accord with this statement. When I began teaching, the schoolroom was not supposed to be a very interesting place, and this great profession was looked upon by many as being something of secondary importance. Now the interest of all America is focused upon America's schools and their importance to our survival as a nation. No one can ever tell me that education, rightly directed without propaganda, cannot change the individual, community, country, state, and the world for the better. It can. There must be health, science, technology, the arts, and conservation of all worthwhile things that aid humanity upon this earth. And there must, above all, be character education. As a teacher in a one-room school where I taught all 8 grades, and then high school as a principal of rural and city high schools and superintendent of city and county school systems, I learned by experience that teaching is the greatest profession there is, and that the classroom can be made one of the most exciting places on earth for young, middle-aged, and older people to improve themselves for more useful and richer living. I left teaching, the profession I loved, because I thought I couldn't make enough to live. I raised sheep, lectured, wrote novels, and made money, but my heart was always in the schoolroom. The 10 books I wrote before The Thread That Runs So True are now out of print, but this book has lived on because it is created of the things that are eternal in the destiny of the human race. Each year its sale has gradually increased. I've heard about it from parents of all strata of American life and from youth and fellow teachers. During the regular school terms, I have received on an average 10 letters per day from high school and college students. I am grateful for this great response. These letters affirm my belief that the vast majority of people are essentially the same, that we desire most of all to improve ourselves through learning, books, and contacts with others, that we strive in youth and throughout our lives for continued personal improvement. One thing I've learned in my contacts with youth and older people as well is that when I am enthusiastic about my teaching, they are enthusiastic. When I am depressed, they seem to be that way too. Their feelings seem to rise as high as my feelings are high, or as low as mine are low. Therefore, I have tried to be as enthusiastic as I can about any subject I teach. I've learned, too, to be honest with them and never to try to seem more nearly perfect than I really am. If I make a mistake and one of my students corrects me, I thank him. I know that he will ever be alert from now on to catch me in another mistake. He knows that I am not infallible and that we are working together as a team in our living and learning. I respect him and his student rights, and he respects me and my teacher rights. I am slow to condemn him when he fails, and I commend the good he has done if and when he tries. I know as surely as I live and breathe the positive proof of what education can do for a man. That proof is in the individual. What would I be doing without the education I have? I would not have written this book if I had not had an education. My father and mother, with their good and untrained minds, their sterling character, would have done greater things in their much too brief lives had they had only 8th grade educations. I wonder what they would have done had each had a high school education, yes, with college training, but they knew the value of an education because they didn't have it, and therefore they had the good judgment to insist on their children going to school. Yes, the struggle of a youth to amount to something worthwhile is the greatest objective he can have in life. My parents and my teachers inspired me. They changed my life, and I felt I could repay them by inspiring other youth. This means more to me than all the money in the world. I am proud that I have been a teacher and am one today. Teaching is something above and beyond teaching lessons and facts from books. It is this, but more too. It is helping a youth to find a path of his own that will eventually lead him through fields of frustration and modern pitfalls of destruction until he finds himself. It is so true that we do not live by bread alone. In any youth who has ever come to school to me, I have seen something essentially good, a potential that needs to be developed. It is the teacher's duty to develop this good potential in each young individual, and teachers have done it too. Make no mistake about it. Unfortunately, there is no way to measure all the good our teachers have developed in youth. Once a young high school principal faced an assembly of teachers and administrators, and his first words were, "I would not be here before you if it were not for one who is sitting back in your midst. I don't know where I would be." It was hard for me to restrain the feeling that passed through me. My mind flashed back to his broken home, no one to help him, and how I took him to college, gave him $5, all I could spare. I left him stringing beans in the college dining room. He was just one of many. How can any monetary payment ever equal such compliment? And I am in firm belief that a teacher lives on and on through his students. I will live if my teaching is inspirational, good, and stands firm for good values and character training. Tell me, how can good teaching ever die? Good teaching is forever, and the teacher is immortal. September 1958, Jesse Stuart. So I didn't mention, but this book, the copyright was 1949, and then he had added that preface when it was printed again. If we work upon marble, it will perish. If we work upon brass, time will efface it. If we rear temples, they will crumble into dust. But if we work upon immortal minds, if we endue them with principles, with just fear of God and love of our fellow man, we engrave on those tablets something which will brighten to all eternity. And that was Daniel Webster, that quote. So part 1, the needle's eye that does supply. Monday morning when I started on my way to school, I had with me Don Conway, a pupil 20 years of age who had never planned to enter school again. I was the new teacher here at Lonesome Valley, and I didn't know what kind of brains he had. He had left school when he was in the 4th grade, but I did know that he had 2 good fists and that he would be on my side. All day Sunday while I had worked at the schoolhouse, I was trying to think of a plan so I could stay at Lonesome Valley School. I knew I had to stay. I knew if one had to go, it would be Guy Hawkins. I might have to use my head a little, but that was why I had it. It had taken a lot of persuasion to get Don Conway to return to school. He had planned to get married after his tobacco crop was sold, but I explained the value of an education to him in dollars and cents. I told him I would teach him how to measure a field and figure the number of acres, how to figure the number of bushels in a wagon bed, corn bin, and how many cubic yards of dirt one would have to remove to dig a cellar or a well. Don Conway was interested in this type of knowledge. I told him no man should be married and live on a farm unless he knew these simple things, for he could easily be cheated the rest of his days. I was interested in his learning these things all right, but I was interested in something else. Don, his 2 small brothers, his sister, Veda, and I went to school together. I congratulated John Conway for sending all his children but one. I told him he should set the example for other farmers on the creek. It would have been hard on John to try to worm and sucker his 10 acres of tobacco and care for his other crops if Flossie, his older daughter, had not volunteered to help him. And Bertha, his wife, assured him she would divide her time between the housework and work in the field. Flossie, 18 years old, who had left school 6 years ago, would gladly have started back to school if I had insisted, but I knew John and Bertha had to have someone left to help them. I insisted and almost begged Don to return to school when he and I were sitting on the porch late one Sunday afternoon, and Ova Sailors and Guy Hawkins rode past on their horses. They glanced toward the porch for their first look at the new teacher, never spoke, but rode silently down the road. Don Conway looked at Guy Hawkins and Ova Sailors, and then he looked at me. He didn't ask me how old I was. I didn't tell him in 18 more days I would be 17. One had to be 18 before he was old enough to teach school. Don Conway knew the fate of my sister when she was employed to teach the Lonesome Valley School. He knew how Guy Hawkins had blacked her eyes with his fist and had whipped her before the Lonesome Valley pupils. She was a fair-haired, beautiful blue-eyed girl of 19 when she had come to Lonesome Valley. She went home a nervous wreck long before her school was finished. After I'd seen the way my sister was beaten up, I begged to go to Lonesome Valley. My parents would have none of it. They thought if I went hunting trouble, I would get more than my share. But I made the mistake at Lansboro High School of going to the wrong room. I'd forgotten the Greenwood County Rural teachers were having teacher's examination in our American Literature room. And when Superintendent Harley Staggers, who didn't know all his teachers, mistook me for a rural teacher, an idea came to me. I knew the school. I wanted, if I passed the examination, I made a second-class certificate. Then I had John Hampton, a rural teacher and friend, contact John Conway and get the school for me. Superintendent Staggers didn't want me to go to Lonesome Valley, but there wasn't anything he could do about it after John Conway, Lonesome Valley District School Trustee, recommended me. That was why I was here to teach school. When Dawn and I reached the schoolhouse, at least 35 pupils were waiting outside. Guy Hawkins and Ova Sailors were standing together near the coal house with their torn and tattered first-grade books. They looked out of place with the other pupils. They were larger than either Dawn or me. They were older, too. They looked at me when I said good morning to them. Many of the pupils turned shyly away and did not speak. They were waiting for the schoolhouse to be unlocked so they could rush in and select their seats. Each had his dinner basket or bucket in his hand. The majority of them carried tattered, edged, and backless books. I thought we had reached the schoolhouse very early. It wasn't 8 o'clock, and school didn't start until 8:30. The July sun hadn't dried the dew from parts of the valley yet. Dew was ascending in white, formless clouds from the tobacco, cane, and corn patches, but the people in Lonesome Valley went to bed early and got up early. All of the pupils in Lonesome Valley came from farms. The girls wore pigtails down their backs tied with all colors of ribbons. They wore clean print dresses, and they were barefooted. Not one pupil in my school, large or small, boy or girl, wore a pair of shoes. I'd never seen in my life so many barefooted people, young, middle-aged, and old as I had seen in Lonesome Valley. Wearing gloves on their hands in summer was the same to them as wearing shoes on their feet. They just didn't do it. "Well, I'm opening the door," I said to break the silence of my pupils. When I opened the door, they laughed, screamed, and raced for the schoolhouse. Their shyness was now gone. There was a mad scramble to get inside the schoolhouse for seats. Then there was some discussion among them as to who would sit by whom. Girls had selected their seatmates. There were a few controversies and a few hurt feelings. Often 2 pupils wanted to sit by the same person. No trouble with Guy and Ova. They walked inside reluctantly and sat down in a seat on the boys' side, farthest from my desk. "Now let me make an announcement to you before school starts," I said, after walking up to my desk. "There will not any longer be a girl's side and a boy's side. Sit any place you want to." They looked strangely at one another. Not one boy would cross to the girl's side. Not one girl would cross to the boy's side. In Lonesome Valley, it was hard to break a teaching tradition more than a century old. But after I had been to high school, where there were no such thing as a girl's side and a boy's side in a schoolroom, I didn't see why it wouldn't work in Lonesome Valley. Little did I dream that what I had said there would make news in Lonesome Valley. that it would be talked about by everybody, and that many would criticize me and call my school a courting school. Boys and girls sitting together? Who had ever heard tell of it? The schedules were not made out for the teacher at the superintendent's office. No one had ever heard of such routine. Each teacher had to make his own schedule, and that was what I had done long before I left home for Lonesome Valley. I knew what I had to teach, and I went to work, making out my schedule and dividing my time as accurately as possible for my 6 hours of actual work. I had to conduct 54 classes in this time, for I had pupils from the chart class to and including the 8th grade. When I walked down the broad center aisle and pulled on the bell rope, the soft tones sounded over the tobacco, corn, and cane fields and the lush green valley. With the ringing of this bell, my school had begun. I knew that not half the pupils in the school census were here. There were 104 in the school census of school age for whom the state sent per capita money to pay for their schooling. I had 35 pupils. I thought the soft tones of this school bell through the rising mist and over warm cultivated fields where parents and their children were trying to eke out a bare subsistence from the soil might bring back warm memories of happy school days. For I remembered the tones of the Plum Grove school bell and how I longed to be back in school after I had quit at the age of 9 to work for 25 cents a day to help support my family. If I could have, I would have returned to school when I heard the Plum Grove bell. So I rang the bell and called the Lonesome Valley pupils back to school, back to books and play. For going to school had never been work to me. It had been recreation, and I hoped it would be the same for my pupils in Lonesome Valley. During my first day, all I did was enroll my pupils in their classes, call them up front to the recitation seat, and give them assignments in the few textbooks that they possessed. At that time, the textbooks were not furnished by the state. Each pupil had to furnish his own. If he didn't, there was a meager allotment of cash set aside by the Greenwood County School Board of Education to buy books for those whose parents were not able to buy them. I knew that many would buy books after the tobacco crops had been sold or the cane had been made into sorghum and sold. These were the money crops in Lonesome Valley. While enrolling my pupils, I made some temporary changes in seating arrangements. I often put a pupil without a book, beside a pupil with a book, if they were in the same grade. As I enrolled the pupils, I tried to remember and familiarize myself with each name. I tried to get acquainted with my pupils. I found them very shy. I was a stranger among them, though I had grown up under similar circumstances with equivalent opportunities. There were approximately 30 miles separating their Lonesome Valley from my W Hollow, but I was a stranger here. When I dismissed my pupils for the first recess, a 15-minute period between the beginning of the school day and the noon hour, I was amazed to see them all jump up from their seats at the same time and try to be the first out of the house. Big pupils rushed past the little ones, and there was so much confusion and disorder, I knew they would never leave the room like this again. Why were they running, I wondered. I had a few minutes' work to do before I could join them on the playground. Before I had finished this work, I heard the tenor of their uneven voices singing these familiar words. The needle's eye that does supply, the thread that runs so true. Many a bow have I let go because I wanted you. Many a dark and stormy night when I went home with you, I stumped my toe and down I go because I wanted you. I walked to the door and watched them. They had formed a circle, hand in hand, and around they walked and sang these words, while two pupils held their locked hands high for the circle to pass under. Suddenly, the two standing, one inside the circle and one outside, let their arms drop down to take a pupil from the line. Then the circle continued to march and sing while the two took the pupil aside and asked him whether he would rather be a train or an automobile. If the pupil said he'd rather be an automobile, he stood on one side. If a train, he stood on the other of the two that held hands. And when they had finished taking everybody from the circle, the two groups faced each other, lined up behind their captains. Each put his arms around the pupil in front of him and locked his hands. The first line to break apart or to be pulled forward lost the game. 15 minutes were all too short for them to play the needle's eye. I let recess extend 5 minutes so they could finish their second game. It had been a long time since I played this game at Plum Grove. These words brought back pleasant memories. They fascinated me. And my Lonesome Valley pupils played this game with all the enthusiasm and spirit they had. They put themselves into it, every pupil in the school. No one stood by to watch. Because they were having the time of their lives, I hated to ring the bell for books. I lined them up, smaller pupils in the front and larger ones behind, and had them march back into the schoolhouse. Guy Hawkins and Ova Sailors were the last on the line. When they came inside the door, Guy asked permission to go with Ova after a bucket of water. We didn't have a well or a cistern at the schoolhouse. We had to get water from some home in the district. I told them they could go, but not to be gone too long, for the pupils, after running and playing, were thirsty. The July sun beat down on the galvanized tin roof. This made the pine boards so hot inside they oozed resin. We raised all the windows, but still the place was hot as the room in which I slept at Conway's. My little room upstairs with a high unscreened window of only one sash didn't cool off until about midnight. Then I could go to sleep. I knew the reason that all the rural schools had to begin in July, though the farmers had objected because they needed their children at home to help them with farm work. Rural schools began early because coal was an added expense for winter months. The county schools all over the state had barely enough funds to keep them going, and if they could have school during the hot months, it sheared away a great expense from their budgets. But it was hard on the children and the teachers. The first bucket of water Guy and Ova brought didn't last 5 minutes. The majority of the pupils were still thirsty. I sent Guy and Ova back for more, telling them to borrow another bucket. I sent them in a hurry, and I knew I had to do something about the dipper problem. At Plum Grove, too, we had all drunk from the same dipper, but when I went to Landsboro High School, I was taught something different. So I made an important announcement to my pupils. I told them each had to bring his own drinking cup the next day. It could be a glass, teacup, gourd, dipper, just so it was his own and no one else drank from it. My pupils looked at one another and laughed as if my announcement was funny. But I had seen sweat run from their faces into the dipper, and the next in line put his mouth where the sweat had run or where the other pupil had put his lips. I noticed, too, several pupils had put the rim up near the handle to their mouths, so I knew they didn't like to drink after the others. On Tuesday, they brought their dippers, tin cups, and glasses. Only a few had forgotten, and I stopped with my busy schedule of classwork long enough to teach them how to make paper drinking cups. I showed them how to take a clean sheet of paper from a tablet and fold it in to hold water. I gave them a lecture about drinking water. I told them never to drink from a stream. I told them how I had gotten typhoid fever twice, once from drinking cool water from a little stream and once from drinking in a river. I had my pupils use the dipper to dip water from the bucket into their cups. They accepted my suggestion gladly. I also borrowed another water bucket from Bertha Conway and brought it to school. The one bucket allowed me for 35 pupils, and there would be more as soon as the farmers were through with their summer plowing and worming and suckering tobacco. Stripping their cane and boiling the juice to syrup was not enough. They played hard at recess and noon, and in the time of books sat in the schoolroom almost as hot as an oven. Tuesday, when I stood beside Guy Hawkins and showed him how to hold his book when he read, my pupils laughed until I had to stop them. I was trying to teach Guy to read as he stumbled over the simple words in the first grade reader. My pupils laughed because Guy was taller by 2 inches than I was and heavier. He had a bull neck almost as large as his head and a prominent jaw. His beard was so heavy that he had to shave every day. Wouldn't Coach Wilson like to have him, I thought. He would make the best tackle Landsboro High School ever had. Guy had big hands. His right hand covered the back of the first reader, and he had powerful arms. The muscles rippled under his clean blue faded shirt. I measured him as I stood beside him. I knew that if I ever had to fight him, it would be a fight, and I knew that I wasn't going to fight him unless he forced me to fight. He was more powerful physically than I was, and the outcome of our fight might depend on the one who successfully landed the first haymaker to the other's jaw. Then I looked down at Ova Sailors sitting on the recitation seat beside me. Another tackle for Coach Wilson, I thought. This pair would be a coach's dream. Pity some coach doesn't have them instead of me. If it were not for these two young men, I wouldn't have had any trouble disciplining my school. All the other pupils played hard and they were obedient. They would have been good in their classwork if they had had the proper training. I had 10-year-old pupils just starting to school, 19-year-olds in the first grade, 14-year-olds in the second grade. I had one 12-year-old girl in the 8th grade. They had not been promoted because they had never attended a full school term. They had taken the same grade over and over until they could stand and recite some of the beginning lessons from memory. "Guy, how long have you been in the first grade?" I asked. "Oh, about 8 years," he laughed. "You're not going to be in it any longer," I said. "Why?" he asked. "Because I'm going to promote you," I said. "Tomorrow, you start in the second grade." Then I had Ova Sailors read. He had also been in the first grade 8 years. I promoted him. When these young men sat down again, I saw them look at each other and laugh as if they thought my promoting them was funny. I knew they accepted school as a joke, a place to come and see people, a place where they could join a circle of smaller children and play the needle's eye, and I knew there wasn't much chance of reasoning with either one, but I had a feeling that time would come. I didn't believe they were coming to school for any good. I felt that Guy was waiting his chance for me. I was not going to take any chances. I was going to give him the full benefit of the doubt. I had doubted that my second class certificate and my 3 years in high school qualified me to teach school, but now when I measured my knowledge with my pupils, I knew without a doubt that I was an educated man. I had never known that youth could be so poorly trained in school as were my Lonesome Valley pupils, but unless I was chased out of the school as my sister had been, I was determined to give them the best I had. So we'll stop right there today. Really interesting already. You can just picture the school in your mind and those older students going, and as he said there at the end, what you think, well, why would they want to come to school? Maybe in one way they wanted to learn a little bit, but it was entertainment. In those days there was nothing, nowhere to go, no entertainment, no TVs, and if you couldn't read, there wasn't no books. There probably wasn't no books anyway. So places like school and church was really your social outings, your entertainment, if you will, for the week. So really interesting though. And when, of course, you got to remember, I've got to remember what I'm about to say. He's talking about the 1940s, so when he was teaching, 1949. Huge difference between then and today, of course. But reading this book has made me think about teachers. My brother Paul was a teacher for many, many years before he became a principal. And then a lot of you, if you watch my other videos, you know he retired at Christmas after being a principal for a long time. So he spent his life in education. But it made me think of the teachers, in my school when ones come to mind. Of course, Mr. Moffitt, one of my beloved teachers, he's no longer with us. Mr. Smart, Mr. Little, Mr. Caldwell, Miss Salt, Miss Reeves, all the ones made me think of all them. And one reason, of course, just because they were my teachers, but also I went to a rural school. Now, I live in a rural area, but even in our area, certain schools, kind of like he was talking about, his school that he had just left was, really not that far away when you thought about it, but it seemed like such a different place. Well, it was kind of like that when I was in school at Martins Creek Elementary School, or Martins Creek School, when I was in elementary school. And so the bigger schools were in Murphy, in town, and then the outlying ones, Martins Creek's not the only one, was the smaller ones. But I remember when I was young at Martins Creek, it was a much smaller school, and, sometimes folks, maybe we got looked down on because maybe people thought we were backward or real country and done things different than everybody else. And the part he mentioned about the recess, that was one of the things I remember people would joke and say, well, if you go to Martins Creek, all you have to do is have recess and drink Cokes, which was not true, neither one of them. But we did have recess, we did. And that little 15 minutes he's talking about in the morning, we had that every day. And on Friday, it was doubled, and you had 30 minutes. So, and then we got time at lunch, and then we got an afternoon recess too. I think was really important, all that was. That was, we run, we played, we talked, we, depending on where you're at in the grades, the different activities you're doing, jumped rope, we loved to jump rope, we had a playground. So wonderful, fun times. And then when I did come time for me to leave that school and go to that bigger school in Murphy, unlike these kids that he's teaching, I was not behind. I went right in where I was supposed to be. I was learning, even though I got to have recess. So I was really... not that I went to a school this rural or in those times when kids, there wasn't as many regulations and kids didn't have to go to school and the state didn't supply the books and all those kind of things. It still did put me in mind of my old Martins Creek days for sure. And not that we had students that age, of course not 20 years old or anything like that. But another thing reminded me of my Martins Creek days was because we did have a small school. Sometimes, depending on the class, it would be split. And so for instance, when I was in 5th grade, there was some 4th graders in my class. And those 4th graders that were in there were like the top of the class, the ones that were more advanced. Then when I was in 7th grade, I was in the more advanced kind of class, so I was in with the 8th grade. So sometimes we did have split classes like that. Such a different time, though, how it's funny how he kind of accidentally, even though he wanted to go back and he wants to get Guy, for beating up his sister and sending her home crying and making her nervous and blacking her eyes and all that. But then he just kind of accidentally ended up being the teacher there when he walked into that room, and they just assumed he was there to take the test. And then once he started thinking, oh, if I take this test and pass it, then maybe I can finagle my way into getting there, and he did. But how different that then when he come to that community there, Lonesome Valley, he had to stay with somebody. So the trustee, and he talks a lot more about that later in the book, so we'll get to hear more about that. Interesting in this part, you can begin to hear, especially when he was talking about the dew. He has beautiful descriptive writing as the book goes on, just where he just paints a picture with the beauty of his words of, I don't live in Kentucky, but it's very similar to here, and just that picture of the dew, summer dew, and the fields of tobacco and corn and sorghum and all that just really, really speaks to Appalachia. So I really love that, and we got a peek of that. Interesting about the girls' side and the boys' side at school. I didn't have any of that when I was growing up, but I have been to a lot of churches in my youth where kind of the men sat on one side and the women sat on the other. As you went, it's funny, that was mostly in the front of the church, and as you went back, then more couples might sit together or something. But that was interesting. It's not so much like that now. Mostly families just sit with families. And then those wonderful games, the Needle's Eyes, what he was playing. Several years ago, it may have even been when it seems like I was in Kentucky when I thought of doing this, because I used to go to Berea, me and Corey and Katie did, to contra dance. But I had a whole series about games on the Blind Pig and the Acorn. I will link to that archive of those games if you want to go read them. Some of them was ones I played when I was a kid, like Red Rover, and then others was ones I found, from Foxfire and different places that I had never really heard of, but other people had when I wrote about them, so I'll link to that. But I've never heard of this Needle's Eye. That sounds like a really fun game, though, and you can see one that kids would really enjoy, singing the little song and then, all the tug-of-war pulling. And then the only other thing I wrote down to talk about was the hygiene. It's interesting that they did need to learn that, but of course if you get a cold and then you're all drinking out of the same dipper, then you're going to get it. And certainly when I went to school, things were not like that. We had water fountains, we didn't have a dipper. Those kind of things have changed automatically over the years. But it is something I've thought about recently, being around some younger kids, helping out with different things. It's strange back then that he felt the need to teach hygiene, to kind of teach them about how they could catch each other's germs, and then about drinking out of the stream. You might get typhoid, you could get, we know today there's other parasites and things like that. But sometimes it's almost like, I don't know if this makes sense to you or not, but like we've went so far that we've went back to that sometimes. Sometimes I think kids today, not all of them, but some of them could benefit from a class on hygiene, how to, I don't know, I'm talking about those teachers back then. I remember Mr. Smart, dear sweet man, him and his wife she taught at the high school. I had her when I went to high school, had her for homeroom. I didn't ever have her as a teacher, Dolly. But I can remember him just leaned back in his desk, like kind of looking out the window. Martins Creek School burnt down, but I can still remember what room we was in, you know, the room, and he's looking out the window with his feet propped up and said, "How can I say this? How can I say this? Some of you need to take a bath." That's what he said. And then he goes on to talk about how, you know, you're healthier if you're cleaner, and, you know, you need to take care of your, like, for example, your feet. I don't know if it was a boy, maybe, or maybe it was a girl. I don't know that he could smell their feet, but how you need to take care of them and wash them and keep them clean, because, you know, you walk on them. They're the ones, your feet's what gets you around. And if you don't take care of your feet, they can develop problems and all this. But sometimes I think maybe we need to do that again. Maybe we've always needed to do that. Probably just some kids need that sort of instruction more than others. I hope, though, that you enjoyed this first little peek into the book. I'm telling you, it gets very exciting in the school. So be sure to stop back by next Friday to find out what happens next. Of course, you're already wondering, I'm sure, is he going to fight Guy? What's going to happen with that? But do please leave a comment and let me know what you thought about this first reading.